So let's jump straight into it, right? My paper is called Pagan Magic and the Marvelous, Songs of Enchantment in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Silmarillion. And I'll first start talking about magic, which is a difficult category to map and conceptualize, right? So Tolkien himself tried to unravel the many meanings of this word, from the type of elvish magic that is closer to art in its completeness, to the works of the magician, which he considered vulgar, the devices of the laborious. And to this type of elvish magic, Tolkien applied the concept of enchantment, the elvish craft that produces secondary worlds, and I quote, into which both designer and spectator can enter to the satisfaction of their senses while they are inside. But in its purity, it is artistic in desire and purpose. So the magic work of the magician for Tolkien was not an art, and it could only produce changes in the primary world. It was more like a technique in this sense. So Tolkien's classification of magic, however, is an attempt to understand the concept from a literary world-building perspective, and therefore the ways that he realizes magical acts in his narratives throughout his works are not limited to this previous dichotomy that I presented. So in the Silmarillion in particular, magic often appears in the form of songs, a conscious philological choice in following the roots of common words related to magic in English, enchantment being one of them, right? Ultimately descending from Latin incantatio, to enchant, which is a word related to cantare, or to sing. Not only that, but the English word spell already highlights the relationship between magic and the spoken word, with Old English galdr and Old Norse galdr closely following Latin incantatio in the idea of working magic through song. So, as a medievalist and philologist, Tolkien took advantage of his knowledge to craft instances of magical prowess in developing the first age of art, utilizing medieval conceptions of the supernatural in his writing. Having said that, we can try to understand how magic worked from a medieval European perspective, and how these concepts may have influenced Tolkien's writing. So the French historian Jacques Le Goff, in his work The Medieval Imagination, divided the supernatural phenomena in medieval Western thought into three distinct categories: mirabilis, the marvelous as we understood today, or close to what we understood today, with roots in the pre-Christian times; magicus, originally a neutral term for magic, since it included both good and evil forms of it, but later acquiring satanic associations and eventually becoming exclusively malevolent. And finally, there is the miraculosus, the miracle, which is a church-sanctioned and rationalized marvel, which had the Christian God as their single altar. According to Le Goff, a key characteristic of the medieval marvelous was the fact that they easily merged with everyday events of the real world, to the point they were featured in texts matter-of-factly, and even appeared in the ancestry of several influential families, for example, the supposedly supernatural forebear of the Plantagenets. Similarly, the many marvels of the first age of Arden are featured organically, notably with elvish characters, from whom magic was almost a form of natural art. I will digress here for a moment to look at sources of magical thinking that may have seeped into medieval notions of magic and Tolkien's depiction of songs of enchantment. So, going back to Latin, Dickie explains that ancient Roman tradition had the supernatural practice of incantare or praecantare, which were pretty synonyms, both related to singing. Another variation of this practice was the act of excantare, literally to sing out, but also in the context of incantations to charm out of or away by song. So on the one hand, excantare could be used for positive actions, such as healing, removing diseases, all by the power of songs. On the other hand, it could also be performed in nefarious ways to spirit crops away, or something related to causing wound or removing health in some way on a particular person. And it was so powerful to be specifically prohibited in the Roman law system, right? So concerning, in this case, practitioners of this practice, ancient Latin literature includes the figure of the praecantatrix, which was a woman who employed incantations to summon ills to harm people, or who employ incantations to drive such ills out. So the abilities of the praecantatrix in the sphere of incantatio are what medieval thinkers would have called magicus, as these practices went back and forth between good and evil in this line of the magical spectrum. Likewise, Old Norse texts from the medieval period also depicted magical acts based on the power of song, represented by the previously mentioned galdr, which Neil Price calls a specific form of sorcery focusing on a characteristic type of high-pitched singing. Price also mentions that these magical songs were pleasing to the ears and probably follow a special rhythm, considering how they were portrayed in the Norse sagas through a poetic meter called galdralag. Like the practices of excantari and praecantari, the performance of galdr also occurred in various contexts, employed both for good and evil actions. The most famous instance I can think of somebody using galdr happens in the poem Grå Galdr, which translates to grow as chanting in modern English, part of the 13th century collection known as the Poetic Edda, in which the character Svipdag brings back his mother Groa from the grave through necromancy and asks her to sing various galdr to protect him. So influential was this magical activity related to the act of singing that the most famous grimoire ever written in Iceland is titled Galdrabok, showing the extent to which this term spread into the popular imagination. Also related to galdr was the practice of seiðr, meaning something close to magic in modern English. And this seiðr was perhaps the most comprehensive word in terms of magical functions. So it could be used from prophecy to healing to causing damage, and even having the possibility of killing an individual. And it was a particularly female domain. It could be performed in combination with galdr in what they called the seiðr galdr, showing its possible singing properties. Once more, what we're seeing here is a realm of song, forming the magicus and the mirabilia of pagan origin, potentially used both offensively and defensively and existing outside the limits of Christian miracles. In a draft, now going back to Tolkien, in a draft of a letter to Naomi Mitchison, Tolkien mentions this concept of magic in the legendarium as neither inherently good nor bad, being dependent on the user's motives and purposes. A perspective that seems to follow Le Goff's conception of the magicus quite closely. In his text, The Pagan Tolkien, Ronald Hutton also noticed how Tolkien's view on magic, presented in that letter in particular, draws on clearly identifiable ancient traditions being utterly unchristian. So, hence my previous digressions before into the realms of Roman and Norse understanding of magical songs. So we can better comprehend two instances of what I actually want to analyze here of the magicus through singing in the Silmarillion from a pagan perspective. Finrod, Felagund, and Sauron's singing duel, and Lúthien's set of magical skills. Finrod's magical moment happened when the Elf King traveled with Beren to help him in the quest for the Silmaril. After they were found and imprisoned by Sauron, Finrod had a power contest with Sauron in the form of songs of enchantment, which Tolkien portrays through a poem, and that I will quote here in full, so bear with me. He chanted a song of wizardry, of piercing, opening of treachery, revealing, uncovering, betraying. Then sudden Felagund their swain sang in answer a song of stain, resisting, battling against power, of secrets kept, strength like a tower, and trust unbroken, freedom scape, of changing and of shifting shape, of snares eluded, broken traps, the prison opening, the chain that snaps. Backwards and forwards sway their song, reeling and foundering as ever more strong, the chanting swelled, Felagund fought, and all the magic and might he brought of Elveness into his words. Softly in the gloom they heard the birds singing afar in Nargothrond, the sighing of the sea beyond the western world on sand of pearls in Elven land. Then the gloom gathered, darkness growing in Valinor, the red blood flowing beside the sea where the Noldor slew the foam riders, and stealing drew their white ships with their white sails from lamp-lit havens. The wind wails, the wolf howls, the ravens flee, the ice mutters in the mouths of the sea. The captives sad and unbound mourn. The thunder rumbles, the fires burn, and Finrod fell before the throne. So this is not what I would call an instance of the miraculosus, right? Ilúvatar, the closest being we can think of to the Christian god and the legendarium, does not intervene or is not the author in this moment of singing of this contest, and he's not a source of miracles as well. And Finrod does not sing with any religious impetus that could justify a miraculous result. To make matters clear, Tolkien uses the phrase songs of wizardry for Sauron, the craft of the magician, and song of stain for Finrod, the elvish type of natural magic closer to art. Finrod sings a song of freedom to break away from the physical and magical prison sung into existence by Sauron. The idea of singing or charming out of a situation is manifestly inspired by the Roman practice of ex cantare, as he is truly singing out of his chains. Following this interpretation, Finrod's magic is also molded in conjunction with the verses contained in the Old Norse Havamal, or the sayings of the High One in modern English, in which Odin enumerates the 18th galdr that he knows. One of them of particular relevance that I quote here: I know a fourth one. If men put bonds upon my limbs, I can chant so that I can walk away. Fetters spring from my feet and chains from my hands. So the inspiration coming from these verses is also quite clear in Tolkien's poem, down to minute details such as the use of this galdr to remove chains and to walk free. The back and forth between Finrod and Sauron in the singing contest portrays the element of the magicus in its original neutrality, but extrapolated beyond the original intention of causing good or evil effects. So Tolkien adds a geographical and historical layers to what defines good and evil magic. As such, Finrod's magic is good because its source is the elvish art from his land of Nargothrond, and ultimately from the apex of that art in Valinor. Sauron's magical song, however, does not draw its power from his evil intentions, but from Finrod's own historically evil actions when he joins Fëanor and when he indirectly participated in the kinslaying of Alqualondë. So in this sense, Sauron is singing a different type of galdr, one that is also inspired by Old Norse galdr, that is listed as the sixth known by Odin, and that the Havamal describes as allowing the god to turn the enemy's own evil against them. So it's a different situation altogether. Indeed, it is Finrod's past deeds that consume him and empower Sauron's song in the poem, reversing expectations of the later Satanic understanding of the magicus. Had Finrod not participated in the horrendous actions against his kin, his song of power would have probably overpowered the magician's tricks employed by Sauron. Finally, the singing aspect of this magical battle is, of course, expressed textually as well. So by the choice of a rhyming poem for the passage, stressing the inherent enchantment this form of literary expression possessed in the pagan past, a quality that poetry nowadays still arguably possesses, right? Now let's go to the case of Lúthien's voice, which is a different one altogether, closer perhaps to the praecantatrix craft and the practice of seiðr galdr. She is introduced in the narrative through her magical singing, her voice a defining characteristic in the text, and I quote, "There came a time near dawn on the evil spring, and Lúthien danced upon a green hill, and suddenly she began to sing. Keen, heart-piercing was her song as the song of the lark that rises from the gates of night and pours its voice among the dying stars, seeing the sun behind the walls of the world. And the song of Lúthien released the bonds of winter, and the frozen water spoke, and flowers sprang from the cold earth where her feet had passed." So separately from the way that singing is presented in Finrod and Sauron's duel, Lúthien shows a deeper connection to the physicality of the world, a primordial power that seems specially related to the female voice in Tolkien's legendarium. See, for example, characters such as Yavanna and Melian, both capable of singing songs of enchantment and modify the word of Arda. So the way that Lúthien sings also resembles the skills of the praecantatrix in the sense that she heals the landscape from wintry death. And demonstrating one of the main uses of the Latin notion of incantatio. Therefore, she manifests the fertilization of the land through her song of enchantment, evoking the magical ability of seiðr, particularly feminine form, as I said before, intertwined with pagan religious practice. Her physical vocality erupts through the text as well, with bouts of alliterative wording that, though still in prose form, brings forth a poetic character to the moment. A song full of sibilants in the uses of words starting with the S sound. So spring, suddenly, sing, song, stars, sing, sun, as if Tolkien was attempting to reproduce the chirping of the nightingale song from which Lúthien gets her nickname Tinuvia. And that internal reference to the nightingale is made explicit in another moment of Lúthien's tale when she comes to the rescue of Beren in Sauron's tower. And I quote, "In that hour Lúthien came, and standing upon the bridge that led to Sauron's isle, she sang a song that no walls of stone could hinder. Beren heard, and he thought that he dreamed, for the stars shone above him, and the trees' nightingales were singing." Once more, we have this presence of sibilant alliteration representing Lúthien's song. Standing, sang, song, stone, stars, shone, singing. And again, a song of enchantment that contains power in and of itself, without divine intervention. So seiðr, as Neil Price informs, could also be used to seek out the hidden, to bring forth good luck, and even to control the weather, which are all actions that represent precisely what Lúthien is doing by singing to Beren at this moment. Mirabilis erupting through her song into Sauron's domain. The same can be said about her encounter with Morgoth, in which she managed to put his entire court to sleep with a song, and a quote, of such surpassing loveliness and of such blinding power that he listened perforce, and a blindness came upon him, and his eyes roamed to and fro seeking her. If we think about the active fear caused by female enchantresses in both Roman and Norse pagan society, which were patriarchal cultures in which women had alternative sources of influence beyond that of physical violence, Lúthien demonstrates an inverse positive application of that fear through the use of the magicus to dominate Sauron and Morgoth, the great evil and male powers of Arda, influenced by good forms of those very female-oriented domains of praecantatio and seiðr. The Norse case is of particular interest from this perspective, since male individuals in the Eddas are normally introduced to magic by asking for female help or learning the art from powerful women. The biggest example is that of Odin learning seiðr from Freya. Lúthien's Song of Enchantment are simply more powerful than the ones from her male opponents, or even Finrod's, for that matter, because Tolkien seemed to be following, in this situation specifically, a mostly pagan and medieval tradition of female empowerment through magical means. The way that Lúthien symbolically causes Morgoth to become blind with her Song of Enchantment shows that interplay between gender and instances of social power, the primal characteristic of voice over vision, orality over the written text, and a popular means of expression versus elitist culture. And I remind you, it was Morgoth's court, after all, that she changed it. In conclusion, looking at these two previous examples of characters employing songs of enchantment in the Silmarillion, Tolkien's debt to the ancient pagan magical practice becomes quite more evident in his choice of wording and his focus on singing as a vector for the medieval classification of the magicus. The effect of mirabilia in Finrod and Lúthien's singing clash with Sauron and Morgoth lies not only in their voice, but in their intention and personal morality, evincing the good and evil sides of the magicus spectrum. Though both events are related to Roman and Norse practice of enchantment, in the original meaning of word as a song, Tolkien expands their uses in the form of implied social commentary about the nature of magic and its history in ancient communities, while weaving his own views on what magic means for him, right? So the elvish craft is physically embodied by Lúthien, refined and powerful in her singing interactions, whilst the artifice of the magician is employed especially by Sauron, for whom singing is a technique that exploits the flaws of others. All of them, however, are mirabilis in nature, and all of them draw from the soup of stories contained in the songs of the pagan past. Thank you very much.
That was really excellent. Thank you, Rafael. Yes, got the hearts and thumbs ups and the excitement from the gathered congregation. So we've got at least one question in the Q&A right now, and I've got a couple if others don't jump in before me. So let's hear from Kami first of all. So Kami, loved your reading, they write. What do you make of the link between the Song of Finrod retelling the story of the Noldor's exile / heroic deeds and Lúthien's Song before Mandos, which is the entire story of Arda and the children of Ilúvatar?
I think this relates to the idea of the epic and of the function of the skalds in Old Norse society, where they would retell stories about specific kings or specific people in the halls, right? The same thing used to happen with in Roman society, where poets would do the same, right? I'm not particularly sure if they would do it as in terms of enchantment, but the skalds would. So I think he's drawing from that tradition a little bit as well, right? The idea of speaking into power, right? Speaking into existence, and the power of poetry and song when you are narrating the history of a people and the stories and their legends and so on and so forth. But a good question. I'm going to think a little bit more about it later on.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rafael. We have and Cami says, that's great, thank you. So you acquitted yourself well on that answer. Very good. We have another question from a username whose username is A Drunk History of Middle-earth Podcast. Thank you so much for the talk. Can you tell me again what the Norse tradition of magical singing was that you mentioned? Just a point of clarification, and do you recommend any sources to read up on it?
The magical traditions of singing in Norse tradition were galdr, right? Seiðr could involve some magical singing as well, because we have the fusion between seiðr and galdr and seiðr, right? They would even follow a very specific poetic meter called galdralag for this type of enchantment when represented in text and also in orality. Neil Price is still, I think, the best source for this in terms of discussing magic, right? He has a book dedicated to it. And I cannot think right now on the top of my head of other sources, but I can research. You can get into contact with me through my email. So, but I think Neil Price is still like the best source for it.
Great. Thanks for that, Rafael. And if you want to drop some of those names in the chat after our Q&A, that might help some folks who are interested in following up. Thomas asks, is there a connection between the pagan Excantare and the biblical Song of Songs that you're aware of?
That I am aware of? No. But it could have. I'm not certain. In this one, they got me there, but I'm not certain. It's possible, right? With the idea of singing out and everything. Many concepts from Roman tradition passed on into Catholicism, right? So it is possible that at least when you consider the translation of the Bible, it is possible that they may have used these kinds of terminology when dealing, right, with those ideas. But I'm not certain. Sorry.
Sure. Absolutely. So we've got a question from Alex. I was wondering if Tom Bombadil's songs, with particular reference to those he uses to dispel the Barrow-wights, have to do with the magicus you mentioned, or with the concept of the miraculous. Tom Bombadil being a supernatural being of benevolent nature. Great talk, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the liminal point, right? Right between magicus and miraculosus, right? Because we don't know Tom Bombadil's origin, right? The way it is described reminds me more of Excantare, right? In the way that it drives the spirits out, and also a little bit of galdr, because it was used in that sense as well in Old Norse society, especially in terms of the dead. So I think that's very interesting. But we don't know if it is actually miraculosus because of Tom Bombadil's position, like cosmological position in Middle-earth. So it could be, I would say it's the liminal point, right, between both of them. Uncertain, in a way.
It's my sense that these distinctions are maybe not so much stark binaries or trinaries so much as they shade into one another.
Yes, it's a spectrum again, right?
Right.
So.
One more from the chat then. Gary asks, what do you make of Galadriel in the context of your presentation? She spent some time in Doriath with Melian, and at the end of the War of the Ring destroys Dol Guldur with her enchantments.
Yeah, Galadriel's situation, I would say, is closer to seiðr a little bit because she... Tolkien doesn't use necessarily the word singing for her, and because seiðr was a more generic term, right, for magic, I would say her actions draw parallels with the Old Norse idea of seiðr. She is a female enchantress, after all, right? And seiðr was a female domain. And the amount of power she can use with only magic reminds me of seiðr as well. Of course, Tolkien wouldn't use those terms for the situation, right? But there are several similarities from what we know, right? What we have about seiðr that survived times, right? Because we don't have so much information as to say how the rituals were acted, or we have some ideas, right? But there are many similarities to how Tolkien describes her, and a seiðr kona, which would be a woman who knows seiðr, right? I hope I answered the question.
I think helping to situate it in those terms is really helpful. So let's see here. We have time for exactly one more. And boy, I really want to pick your brain about the you mentioned Ronald Hutton and of course his history of the pagan reconstructionism and pagan witchcraft in the 20th and 21st centuries. I feel like there's a lot of generative stuff to talk about there, but I'm going to give it to Nikki, our last question, who asks, how would you classify Aragorn's healing powers within these categories? Everybody wants to know, okay, is this a miracle? Is it a marvel? What is it? What is it, buddy?
Okay, if we go by the medieval classification, because he doesn't mention Eru, right? And he doesn't mention any type of religious idea behind it, at least not clearly, right? We cannot call it miraculous, right? It would be magicus, but it's up to interpretation, right? It depends on how you see it. You see that his power is very limited, right? It's only related to healing specifically. And it's important to notice that healing was always considered to be a positive use of the magicus. So at least it is closer to the miraculous in a sense, right? But from a medieval perspective, it could only be considered miraculous if God was its author, right? Or if it was a saint manifesting that power through God. In this case, Aragorn manifesting healing through Eru's power, but it's up to debate, right?